What happens when confidence collides with reality, and the spotlight suddenly feels too small for two rising stars? This is where the conversation shifts from hype to truth, from branding to basketball. Because Angel Reese didn't just make a casual comparison. She placed herself in the same conversation as Michael Jordan, one of the most untouchable standards in the history of sports. And she didn't whisper it. She didn't hint at it. She said it out loud, confidently, unapologetically, for the entire world to hear. At the exact same time, in a completely different lane, Caitlin Clark was doing something far more dangerous. She was letting her game speak so loudly that it began to reshape the entire structure of women's basketball. Two players, two mindsets. One building a brand through noise, the other building a legacy through undeniable production. And right now, the gap between those two paths is becoming impossible to ignore. Let's take that comparison seriously for a moment, because it deserves more than a reaction. It deserves examination. When Angel Reese said she modeled her game after Michael Jordan, that she mirrored his offensive and defensive instincts and saw similarities in how they played, she wasn't just making a statement about inspiration. She was aligning herself with a benchmark that defines greatness at the highest possible level. Michael Jordan wasn't just dominant. He was efficient, surgical, inevitable. A career field goal percentage above 50%. 6 championships in 6 finals appearances. 6 finals MVPs, 10 scoring titles, 5 league MVPs. And beyond the numbers, he built the most powerful athlete brand the world has ever seen, a global empire that still defines sports marketing decades later. That is the standard. That is the weight behind the name. So when that comparison is made, it doesn't invite applause. It invites scrutiny. Now shift the lens back to Angel Reese's actual performance on the court. Yes, the rebounding numbers stand out. They demand respect. Leading the league on the glass as a rookie is not something to dismiss. It shows effort, positioning, physicality. But basketball is not played on rebounds alone. The deeper you look, the more uncomfortable the numbers become. Efficiency begins to tell a different story. Finishing at the rim, the most fundamental skill for a player of her size, becomes a glaring weakness instead of a strength. Shots that should be automatic turn into missed opportunities. Possessions that should end in points instead dissolve into frustration. And this isn't narrative or bias. It's measurable, repeatable, visible in every game, every highlight, and every viral clip that spreads faster than any statistic sheet ever could. When over half of your attempts from the most favorable position on the court fail to convert, the conversation shifts from potential to problem. And this is exactly where the story takes a turn that no one expected, because the criticism didn't come from the outside. It didn't come from analysts chasing headlines or fans arguing on social media. It came directly, personally, and unapologetically from a legend sitting face-to-face with Angel Reese herself. Lisa Leslie, a name that carries authority, credibility, and experience that cannot be questioned, didn't wait for a studio segment or a viral debate. She stepped into Reese's space, onto her platform, into her audience, and delivered a message that cut through everything else. No sugarcoating. No hesitation. Just truth. The issue wasn't her personality. It wasn't her confidence. It wasn't her brand. It was her finishing ability. Her layups. The most basic, essential part of a post player's game. And when Lisa Leslie says that needs fixing, it doesn't land as criticism. It lands as a verdict backed by a career of dominance, efficiency, and excellence in the exact area being questioned. But what makes that moment even more powerful is what it wasn't. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't a takedown. It was mentorship in its rawest form. Because alongside that blunt honesty came recognition, acknowledgement of Reese's defensive energy, her improving handle, her willingness to compete and learn. Lisa Leslie didn't dismiss her. She challenged her. She made it clear that the gap between where Reese is and where she wants to be is not about image. It's about execution. And that kind of honesty, delivered directly and publicly, is something most athletes never receive. It forces a choice: evolve or be exposed. While all of this was unfolding, something entirely different was happening in another city, under another spotlight, with another player who wasn't making comparisons or declarations. Caitlin Clark wasn't talking about greatness. She was producing it in real time. Quietly, consistently, and relentlessly, she began to shift the economics of an entire league. Not through personality alone, but through performance that translated into viewership, ticket sales, and national attention on a scale the WNBA had never experienced before. Games weren't just being played, they were being watched. Arenas weren't just filling, they were selling out. Numbers weren't just improving, they were exploding. This is where the separation becomes undeniable. Because while one narrative is built on projection and personality, the other is built on impact that can be tracked, measured, and verified. Broadcast ratings surged. Attendance skyrocketed. Merchandise flew off shelves. Entire networks began investing at levels that once seemed impossible. This wasn't coincidence, it was cause and effect. Caitlin Clark stepped onto the court, and the entire ecosystem around the league responded. Even when injuries temporarily sidelined her, the audience she brought didn't disappear. It stayed. That is influence. That is transformation. That is what it looks like when a player doesn't just play the game, they change its value. And that's the reality no one can ignore anymore. Because eventually, the market tells the truth. Branding can open doors, but production determines how long they stay open. Comparisons can create headlines, but consistency creates legacy. The difference between hype and greatness isn't loud. It's proven over time, possession by possession, season by season. Right now, the WNBA is standing at a crossroads shaped by two very different approaches to stardom. One fueled by visibility and voice. The other driven by results and impact. The question isn't who is more popular in the moment. The question is who is building something that lasts. There was a moment in that conversation that went far beyond technique, far beyond missed layups, far beyond mechanics. A moment that quietly revealed the entire truth about where the league is heading and who is actually driving it forward. Lisa Leslie looked directly ahead and delivered a statement that wasn't designed to trend, wasn't crafted for headlines, but carried more weight than any statistic or viral clip could ever hold. She said, in the simplest terms possible, that when one player eats, everyone eats. And then she didn't leave it abstract. She didn't keep it theoretical. She applied it directly, unapologetically, to Caitlin Clark. She made it clear that Clark deserves the attention, the endorsements, the spotlight, and the momentum surrounding her because she is actively changing the game itself. Not just playing it, not just participating in it, reshaping it in real time. What made that statement hit even harder was everything that came after it. Leslie didn't just talk about production. She talked about approach, about mindset, about how greatness carries itself when it knows it's real. She pointed out that Caitlin Clark consistently gives respect to the players who came before her, that she acknowledges the history of the game instead of trying to rewrite it in her own image. She emphasized how Clark elevates the people around her, how she shares opportunities, how she builds instead of isolates. There's no walking around like she invented the sport. There's no forced narrative about being the sole reason for its existence. And then came the question that cut through every ongoing debate. Why would anyone have a problem with a player receiving recognition when that same player is directly improving the situation for everyone else in the league? That wasn't motivation. That wasn't opinion. That was a Hall of Famer outlining a cause and effect chain that the numbers have already confirmed. Because when you step back and actually examine what has happened, the scale of the impact becomes almost impossible to process. The transformation isn't subtle. It isn't gradual. It's explosive. Attendance numbers didn't just rise, they multiplied. Arenas that once struggled to fill seats suddenly couldn't contain the demand. What used to be modest crowds turned into packed buildings with thousands more waiting outside the equation. And it wasn't limited to one city, one team, or one fan base. This was a league-wide shift. Everywhere Caitlin Clark went, the audience followed. Home games, away games, neutral venues, it didn't matter. The effect was the same. Buildings filled, energy surged, and the product suddenly felt bigger than it ever had before. This wasn't hype. Hype fades. This was sustained attention backed by measurable growth. And that's exactly what Leslie meant when she talked about everyone eating. Because the ripple effect didn't stop at ticket sales. It moved into the core economics of the league. Broadcast deals that once seemed out of reach suddenly became competitive battlegrounds between major networks. The contracts expanded. Salaries increased. Benefits improved. Structural changes that players had been fighting for over years of negotiations suddenly became achievable, not because the conversation changed, but because the revenue did, because the audience did, because the value of the league itself shifted in a way that could no longer be ignored. Every upgrade, every increase, every improvement can be traced back to one fundamental truth. More people started watching and they stayed. But Leslie didn't stop at economics because the impact wasn't just financial, it was physical. It was visible in the infrastructure of the league itself. Teams weren't just adjusting marketing strategies or television schedules. They were moving entire games into larger arenas just to handle the demand when Clark's team came to town. Think about what that actually means. Franchises were forced to upgrade their venues, to expand capacity, to rethink logistics, all because one player's presence changed the expected scale of attendance. That is not normal. That is not common. That is not something that happens because of personality or branding alone. That is what happens when performance meets timing and creates something bigger than the game itself. And what makes this entire moment even more intense is where it was said. This wasn't a neutral setting. This wasn't a controlled studio debate. This was said directly, in the same space, on the same platform, in front of Angel Reese herself. No filters. No distance. No separation between message and recipient. Because underneath all the conversations about attention, coverage, and recognition, there's been a growing tension, a quiet but undeniable frustration within parts of the league. And, to be fair, some of that frustration makes sense. When you've spent years grinding, building your career, pushing a league forward step by step, and suddenly a new face arrives and generates a level of attention that eclipses everything before it, that's not easy to process. That feeling is real. It's human. It's understandable. But what Leslie did was cut through that emotion and bring the focus back to reality. She didn't dismiss the feeling. She reframed it. She contrasted the way Clark approaches the game, with humility, production, and respect, against the growing tendency of some players to center themselves as the reason for the league's existence. She didn't need to name anyone. The contrast spoke for itself. And then, almost deliberately, she returned the conversation back to Angel Reese and the most fundamental issue at hand, finishing at the rim. In the same breath, in the same setting, one player was being highlighted as a force transforming the league, while the other was being coached on fixing a core part of her game. Same microphone, same moment, completely different realities. And if you want to see how those realities play out beyond conversation, all you have to do is look at the franchises built around each player. Because this isn't just about individuals, it's about systems, results, and direction. In one scenario, a team builds around a player whose presence elevates everyone, whose absence is felt but doesn't collapse the structure, whose influence creates resilience even in the face of injuries and setbacks. Depth develops. Roles become clear. Players step up. The system holds. Success becomes sustainable. Even when the star isn't on the court, the identity remains intact. In the other scenario, expectations rise just as quickly, but the foundation struggles to support them. Injuries expose weaknesses. Chemistry fractures under pressure. Losses pile up, and the narrative shifts from potential to instability. Frustration spills into the public space. Questions begin to surface about leadership, about direction, about what comes next. And suddenly, the conversation is no longer about growth, but about survival. Not about building something lasting, but about fixing something that's already breaking. And this is where everything comes back to the same unavoidable truth. The market doesn't respond to noise. It responds to results. It doesn't reward declarations. It rewards production. You can build a brand, you can build attention, you can build visibility, but if it isn't supported by consistent performance, the gap between perception and reality eventually becomes impossible to ignore. On the other side, when performance leads the way, everything else follows. The audience grows. The money flows. The opportunities expand. And the player at the center of it all doesn't have to demand recognition. It finds them. Right now, the WNBA is evolving faster than anyone predicted. Records are falling. Investments are increasing. Expansion is on the horizon. And at the center of this transformation are two very different approaches to stardom. One loud, confident, and driven by presence. The other steady, efficient, and driven by impact. Both players are talented. Both are influential. But the paths they've chosen are leading to very different outcomes. And the question that now hangs over the entire league isn't just about who is better or who is more popular in the moment. It's about who is actually shaping the future. Because in a league where timing, talent, and opportunity are colliding all at once, the difference between being part of the moment and defining it has never been more clear. And this is where the conversation stops being about moments and starts becoming about trajectories. Because what we are witnessing right now isn't just a comparison between two players. It's a live case study in how greatness is actually built, sustained, and ultimately remembered. The difference isn't just in skill sets or statistics. It's in how each player's presence alters everything around them. Teammates, opponents, organizations, and even the business ecosystem that surrounds the league itself. Because when a player truly shifts the gravity of a sport, you don't have to argue for their impact. You feel it in every corner of the game. Take a step back and look at how systems respond to certain types of players. There are athletes who can put up numbers, who can generate attention, who can create moments that go viral and dominate headlines for a few days. And then there are players who fundamentally change how the game is played, watched, and valued. Those players don't just exist within a system. They force the system to evolve around them. Defensive schemes change. Coaching strategies adapt. Front offices rethink how rosters are constructed. Broadcasters adjust schedules. Sponsors recalibrate investments. Entire infrastructures begin to shift, not gradually, but all at once. That's the level where Caitlin Clark is operating. Her presence doesn't just influence outcomes on the court. It creates a chain reaction that extends far beyond it. Defenses stretch further out than they ever have before, forced to account for range that breaks traditional spacing. Passing lanes open in ways that weren't previously possible because her vision forces defenders into impossible choices. Teammates aren't just participating, they're benefiting from an ecosystem designed around opportunity, movement, and trust. And that's the hidden layer most people miss. It's not just about what she does individually. It's about what becomes possible for everyone else when she's on the floor. And that effect doesn't disappear when adversity hits. In fact, that's where it becomes even more revealing. Because when injuries strike, when rotations get disrupted, when key players go down and the structure is tested under pressure, that's when you find out whether a team was built on a single star or built around a sustainable identity. And in those moments, the difference becomes undeniable. Systems that are rooted in clarity, accountability, and shared roles don't collapse. They adjust. New contributors emerge. Bench players step into larger roles. The culture holds everything together even when the centerpiece is missing. That's not accidental. That's leadership without words. That's influence that exists even in absence. That's what happens when a player's impact is embedded into the DNA of the organization itself. Now contrast that with a different kind of trajectory, one that is fueled by visibility, personality, and undeniable confidence, but still searching for consistency in execution. Because confidence, while powerful, becomes dangerous when it starts outpacing production. It raises expectations faster than results can meet them. It invites comparisons that demand validation at the highest level. And when those comparisons are tied to names like Michael Jordan, the margin for error disappears entirely. Every possession becomes a test. Every miss becomes a talking point. Every weakness becomes amplified under a spotlight that was voluntarily intensified. For Angel Reese, this is the stage she now stands on. There is no denying her presence, her energy, her ability to command attention and build a following that extends beyond basketball. That matters. It has value. It brings eyes to the game. But the deeper question is whether that attention is being reinforced by performance at a level that justifies the comparisons being made. Because eventually, the game itself demands answers. Not in interviews. Not in branding campaigns. On the court, possession by possession, where execution cannot be replaced by narrative. And this is exactly where the gap becomes most visible, not in isolated highlights, but in consistency, in the ability to convert routine opportunities into guaranteed points, in the discipline to refine fundamentals until they become automatic, in the willingness to accept uncomfortable truths and transform them into measurable improvement. Because greatness is not built on what you can do at your best. It's built on what you can do repeatedly under pressure, when everyone in the building knows exactly what you're trying to accomplish. That's why the intervention from Lisa Leslie carries so much weight even beyond the moment itself. Because what she offered wasn't just advice, it was a blueprint. A reminder that no matter how large the platform becomes, no matter how strong the brand grows, the foundation of everything is still rooted in execution. In doing the small things at an elite level. In mastering the basics so completely that they no longer break under pressure. And more importantly, in understanding that growth requires humility, the kind that allows you to hear criticism without defensiveness and turn it into progress. Because here's the reality most people don't want to say out loud. The league doesn't need more personalities. It needs more reliability. It needs players who can be counted on in every situation, not just in moments designed for visibility. It needs consistency that builds trust from coaches, from teammates, from fans, and from the business side that ultimately determines how far the league can go. And this is where the separation between paths becomes almost impossible to ignore. One path is accelerating because it is anchored in production that scales, production that translates into wins, into viewership, into financial growth, into long-term stability. The other path is still searching for alignment between perception and reality, between expectation and execution. And